Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, the world's a better place because you're in it. See what happens when you subscribe. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. On this, our 200th episode, if you can believe it, we talked to the one and only Andrew McBride of Integrity Bridge. He talks about his background, the tactics that he learned, and the story at Albemarle where they got that massive declination of 45%. So hope you enjoy it and crack open a bottle of champagne or something because 200 episodes, baby. That's how we do it. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
You got the champagne out already?
Yeah, well, it's our 200th episode. You know, we got the one and only Andrew McBride on. We're hitting Ethics Experts' fastest growing podcast, business ethics podcast in the world. It's time to celebrate. You know, nobody thought we'd make it to 200 episodes is the big thing.
They all doubted us.
Amazing.
I got my brother and partner here. I got Andrew McBride here. This is going to be a killer episode here. So let's get
Coach, I wish I could kind of reach through the screen and grab it. Whoa.
Yowza. All right. Well, party started, baby.
All right. Party time.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that got everywhere. All right, cool. Welcome to the Ethics Experts. How we doing today?
We're all good. We're glad that we got through the snow crisis here in Charlotte.
Exactly. So we've been real excited to get you on, Andrew. You came on our radar a while back, I think from Tom Fox or somebody like that. And we started to kind of get to know you a little bit. And then you won that phenomenal award. And as I've gotten to know you, I've really stolen a lot of your talk tracks. So you probably heard them. But I just think you have a really unique perspective on the compliance game. And so I'm just excited to dive into your story, to hear about your philosophy and so forth. So I'm going to clean this up and let's get going because I can still hear.
Yeah, so let's take it from the top, Andrew. So, what do you feel like was a big driver of you getting onto this path of compliance? Obviously, you've been very successful, built some great programs, been really innovative. But what kind of pointed you in this direction? Because I feel like everyone has a different origin story.
Yeah. So. It's kind of like starting kind of like super focused on one particular area of compliance, and then over the years realizing that actually related areas of compliance were really not that different, and then getting kind of broader and broader and broader. So you go way back when I was an private practice at a law firm in London called Linklaters. It's one of what they call the magic circle of law firms, which was a super big deal for me. You know, I'm a small town country boy who went to university and then ended up going to the big city and working for one of the biggest law firms. And so that started out in the pretty narrow area of competition antitrust, UK, EU antitrust law. But then over the years, and we can get into this in detail, I've kind of either had opportunities presented to me or I've taken advantage of opportunities proactively to add on different areas of professional kind of experience, including different areas of compliance. So still within antitrust, I kind of then moved to BP. So I moved in-house. And they eventually moved to Chicago and started doing US antitrust law, which was a lot of fun. And then after that, I had BHP, the big mining company, reach out and want to hire me as their global head of antitrust when all of the countries around the world were introducing things. And so I'm still kind of continuing to grow in antitrust. And then finally at BHP, I got progressively broader responsibilities, which meant that I took on sanctions and corruption and state secrets and other kind of related areas like market manipulation. And what I found was that every time I would have a responsibility for a new area of compliance, that it felt a little bit easier to get my arms around it every time, because there's just an approach to figuring out kind of like what the laws and the requirements were, but then applying my increasing experience to wrap that compliance program around those requirements. And so I think what originally I felt was quite daunting getting into somewhere new. Now I kind of really enjoy. I see it as a challenge. Oh, it's a new area of compliance. Let's kind of, roll our sleeves up, get to understand it, and then use our experience of building and operating compliance programs and figure it out.
That's
So
so
it's just
cool.
kind
I
of a-
love that you've talked about, you had these different experiences and you got these different perspectives, and it's kind of easy to look at that and just say, oh, this is kind of a line through a career, but your skill set was growing in those. And I love that you ended with, it's kind of changed your mindset and your perspective as you see and run into new challenges. That's really cool context of, how, what it took to arrive at where you're at. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is that then you have perhaps less patience for kind of people who are in one particular subject matter expertise, who think theirs is the most important area of law, like an outside counsel, or who think in a completely siloed mentality. Because when you see the bigger picture, you think, well, actually, what you're doing on targeted training, allocation of training to particular employees is no different to what we're doing in kind of like, corruption compliance or a data privacy compliance or whatever. And so I began that really started me on a journey, which I really got to realize at Albemarle, of taking that holistic approach to manage compliance risk, and where there are opportunities to get more bang for your buck by having one third-party risk management process, not 5, or, embedding all of the compliance requirements for sales into one sales training kind of presentation rather than 5. That experience helped me then to realize that at my last company.
So what were some of those principles that you saw as you kind of expanded the scope of what you were over that were so transferable? You moved from, I don't know, there's 30 probably different things that you've been able to like apply this thing to.
I mean, it's really, if you boil it down, it's the kind of the hallmarks of an effective compliance program. I mean, it's trite, but it's true. So the art of the writing of the governance, the training, the communications, the monitoring, the underpinning of data analytics across all of that, the systems. It's about, it's those kind of recurring themes behind those hallmarks that you just kind of apply. And, what I found was that in as much as those skill sets were useful in kind of improving our compliance programs, we also were able to help other functions with their own governance as well. So think procurement, sales, finance. We ended up co-authoring some of those functional policies and procedures because actually, compliance, we know a thing or two about writing really good, clear governance. We are very experienced at reaching above and across to other functions to collaborate with them. We have to do that by necessity. Whereas I found that sometimes other functions were kind of very kind of like they were in their own kind of space. They didn't have that experience with doing governance. They didn't have the experience of engaging with other stakeholders. So we were able to come in and almost provide some sort of, consulting service, a bit like what I do now, but internal consulting service to other functions to improve their governance, to improve their data analytics, and then, dip in a few ethics and compliance controls as well as part of our kind of, invoice for services rendered.
Well, I mean, the best way to get your dog to take his medicine is to like put it inside some peanut butter. You know what I'm saying? Give him a little peanut butter with that pill. You know what I mean?
That I heard you say that, and it's so true. And we, if I have a choice between having a self-standing anti-corruption compliance policy or having those requirements incorporated into a sales policy, procurement policy, I would go for the latter any day, because ultimately, that sales policy is the one that the salespeople are more likely to go to, right? That's their job. It's in the same way that if someone is at a manufacturing site, they're going to look at their health and safety kind of procedures because that's part and parcel of doing their job. And then the other benefit is that if you think about like at Albemarle, when I first joined Albemarle, within a month, the company had adopted its core values. We were able to use those core values and apply them in those individual functional settings. So core values, what does that mean for procurement? What does that mean for sales? So for procurement, Yes, there's things like you shall not use a vendor to pay bribes, but there's also, we'll pay our vendors on time, right? That's a core value commitment to our vendors. And so being able to incorporate the core values, the ethics and compliance requirements, as well as the functional requirements into that functional governance was incredibly, I think, helpful and more impactful, I would say.
And you brought something else up that I think is really important. Like, we have, I think, I love this space. I think this space is so interesting. It's, there's so much you have to be good at to be phenomenal at this, right? Like, you have to be a good lawyer. You have to have a good legal mind. You have to understand regulations. You have to understand the business. You have to be persuasive. You have to be able to, reach across the aisle, reach up the leadership stack. And I'm just saying that sometimes I have found, I think that there's a mindset issue in our space. I think a lot of us as compliance officers have started to believe this moniker that we are the Office of No. I don't think we view ourselves that way, but I think we get so caught up in like the minds, like how we exist in the minds of these other folks, it ends up kind of creating a headwind for our effectiveness. And I just think if we can shatter that, if we can shatter those insecurities, and we can recognize that like we have a very, very unique skill set. We're the circulatory system of, like, your body only has one circulatory system, and that's a very specialized system. That's very different than the lungs or the liver or whatever. And so I'm just saying we have a ton of value to bring to other departments. And when we're talking about building bridges, which is the name of your company, Integrity Bridge, I think you had said you picked that name because when compliance is doing its job, it's building all these bridges to these disparate sort of parts of the organization. And all I'm saying is that if we're going to build authentic relationships where people are going to feel like, man, I want to get Andrew in, I want to get the compliance person in because that's in my best interest. That has to start with some kind of a connection and some kind of a conveyance of value. And all I'm saying is like, we have a ton of value to convey that can open up those pathways to start really being a deeper part of the business,
Yeah, completely. And I had at my at disposal the biggest stick that a compliance officer could possibly want, which was being under an FCPA investigation. But I did not use that because I wanted it to be about the value that I brought to supporting functions. Because I was afraid I needed to get some stuff done, but I wanted to kind of seduce people with kindness and collaboration rather than kind of waving the big stick. And then what was really interesting is that during those first 2 years, for sure, I mean, it was all about building the program and addressing the root cause of the investigation. But Albemarle was the world's largest lithium producer with all of the sustainability kind of commitments that comes to that. And the narrative was changing at that global level with a lot of interest in kind of what the company was doing from a human rights point of view. And so the work we were doing in our compliance program, the work that we were doing in human rights, wasn't just about managing the risk. It was actually a differentiator for the company. And we were on sales calls with customers talking about our program as a positive differentiator with folks. And so especially when you're dealing with your sales colleagues, they will happily do anything you want if you're helping them get business.
Totally. Yeah,
right?
totally.
It completely changes the narrative. And then there was another opportunity, obviously, with the increasingly complex geopolitical situation with Russia, Ukraine, and COVID and supply chain disruption. Risk management became kind of really focused. And so I got promoted up to chief risk officer, but my team were doing more broader risk management work, which means that they were increasingly tied to the day-to-day strategic planning of the company. Again, another opportunity that we were taking advantage of that helps to reinforce that positive perception of compliance.
And do you feel like the driver there was you pushing yourself into those conversations, or was it more like them sort of scooting over and pulling a chair up and being like, hey, come on into the sales call? Like, what was the impetus for getting you guys on there?
Yeah, so I think it depends. It varied. So on the sales side, that was for sure. In part, sometimes driven by customers saying, "Hey, we want to understand kind of what your ethics compliance or your human rights forced labor program is," and we would then be brought onto the call. That then would translate into kind of more proactive, like so how we addressed it in marketing materials and communications. So that was good. then on the risk management side, I mean, I think there were kind of like these incidents kind of popping up. And then at the company, we were making big capital investment decisions. We wanted to understand what the risks were associated with that. So there was a pull from the board and from leadership of, we think that we need to wrap a risk assessment around this big investment. Who can help? And they knew that I had experience at that at BHP. And so I was brought in to lead those exercises. And I said, well, if we're going to do it for one project or two projects, then we actually need to upgrade our ERM framework. And so they said, well, great, congratulations. You've got that responsibility. You've got the job as chief risk officer. Go do it.
Do you, so I want to dive into the investigation and all that kind of stuff. And I think, you kind of gave us a glimpse of your philosophy, where you had this big stick that you could wield if you wanted, but you kind of chose not to try to do it in a more sort of effective, perhaps like more sustainable way. Do you feel though at a high level, at the board level or at the leadership, executive leadership level, do you feel like just going through this experience caused them to like reframe and like better understand what compliance or risk could do for the business? Like, was that like scales falling from their eyes a bit?
I think so. I mean, it was a case of one of the biggest kind of positives, I think, from the enhancement of the program, and certainly what we focused on in our advocacy for the DOJ and the SEC, was the compliance process itself is important, right? So if we think about due diligence, the conduct of the due diligence, getting all the documents, the ducks in a row from a documentation point of view, identifying flags, closing flags. But really the really important piece was the discussion, right? So you've done that work. What is all that information telling you? What's the story with your discussion with senior management about the risk, the residual risk after you put in place all your controls? And then what's your discussion with the third party in terms of, you need to up your game in these areas. And so we would have these discussions with management about our highest risk third parties. And sometimes it wasn't just focused purely on compliance risks. There could be other risks that were raised. And so I remember one conversation where a particular vendor was had potential environmental risk because it was all about waste management. And so we brought in our head of HSE to make sure that they were part of the due diligence exercise, but then also the discussion with leadership. So whilst the driver for the reason why that due diligence was going to be done in the first place may have been corruption, we didn't blinker ourselves to think we're only going to look at corruption. If there were other flags or risks that were present, we would then identify what those were, bring in the right people, and then have that discussion with management and then with the actual third party themselves. And that discussion and then the agreed remediation is super important. I mean, it's important on corruption, but we think about human rights. It's actually even more important because you're talking about the human rights of employees and companies in the supply chain.
Right.
You can't, I mean, it's very clear expectation in human rights laws and regulations and standards that, perhaps unlike corruption, you can't just drop a company because they've got a red flag on the corruption risk. You certainly can't do that for human rights. You've actually got to partner with that third party and fix it. So framing the discussion with management, not about managing compliance risk, but just managing risk holistically, right, and then focusing on the remediation, that was super, super important.
Andrew, I love the way you talk about this because it just seems so obvious and it was so effective. And, I think there's a lot for everyone to learn from that. But what do you think puts people on the other side of that? You talked about 2 or 3 things, right? You talked about having the conversation, holistic risk, and remediation. Yeah. Let's kind of start with the conversation piece. I don't think everybody in a compliance and ethics role has that as kind of their primary engagement point. What do you think keeps people from doing that?
Well, so, I mean, there's a volume issue, right? So if you've got thousands of intermediaries, you can't have a in-person discussion with senior leadership with every one of them. And so you then have to kind of make sure that your risk framework is calibrated, that you're really only escalating those third parties that it really matters. And it's not necessarily that every third party has to get escalated to the top. So we had an approval structure where, perhaps it was the regional president that was involved in some of the lower risk, and then the group president for the business at the second level, and then you had the CEO and the CFO at the top level with the general counsel and myself. And so, Frank clearly articulating when there is a need to discussion, and then if there is any discussion, who is it with, is super helpful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate you noting that. Right, like it's one thing to just say you should do this, but I mean, it's helpful to note that there are some trade-offs there, and you need to scale your program for that. Yeah. So, how about the way that you engage with managers? Was that is that just kind of the Andrew way, or did you stumble into that? How did you kind of how did you figure out that was going to be such a change? Because that journey sometimes is what it takes for people to realize all right, it's going to take a little bit more effort, but it's so worth it.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's perhaps a comfort level on my part. So one of the benefits of antitrust is that to actually do antitrust law, you have to have a really good understanding of the company's business and the markets that they're operating, and the strategy. So, I used to do that for years and years of talking about market shares and market concentration and doing M&A. And so by definition, you're dealing with senior people like the presidents of businesses, CEOs, heads of M&A, about how to realize their inorganic growth strategy. And so, for me, then there's a comfort level in helping convene and facilitate those discussions. But I wanted to impart that experience and confidence to my team of, it's not just about the paperwork and the due diligence. The most important thing is about the discussion. And so we would set these meetings up, and it got to a point where I think that they were so well oiled that it was a collaboration between the sales sponsor, so the internal Albemarle employee who wanted to get a third party approved, collaborating with the local compliance manager. They would work on some materials for the meeting to facilitate it. They would lead it. They would articulate the business justification and the compliance risk assessment. And there'll be an opportunity for me and other senior leaders to kind of ask questions. And through that, it was an opportunity for local commercial people to have that time with senior leadership to articulate their strategy, and then also to focus on risk beyond the compliance risk. And I think the senior leaders actually found it a really useful way to understand what was going on at the local level, at the regional level. They would learn things like, how, if it was a freight forwarder or a custom broker, kind of how that would work in practice in particular countries. It was a way for them to get really useful information that they perhaps otherwise wouldn't.
It's funny, there's this sort of dichotomy of compliance being apart from the business or being a part of the business. Yes. And it paradoxically, it's like the more apart from the business you are, the more misconceptions I think you have, right?
That's right.
I know a lot of compliance folks are like, why are we allowing this? Doesn't, why would leadership allow this over at this division? And it's like, well, they probably don't know about it. They probably don't know the intricacies of what the realities are on that shop room floor or at that location. And to your point, I'm just struck again by there's so many unique angles that our departments have within our organizations to add value. And what you just talked about, bringing that meeting together, being that connector and giving some face time to frontline employees that are in the sales department or whatever with those senior leaderships, they both get a benefit from that, and you get a benefit from that, and we're having a conversation, and it's a memorable experience, and all that stuff starts to stack up to really reinforce this new direction that we're trying to take our programs,
Yeah, and obviously, they take it seriously. So I remember a salesperson in Tokyo having to put their third party forward, and everyone knew you needed to get that senior level approval. It was taken very seriously. There was preparation for it, and it was a big thing for that person to be on the call with the CFO of the entire company. And then to kind of continue that theme of how how to make it a rewarding experience, or what does compliance bring to that table? We would flip it. So going to data analytics, companies are big, right? So they don't know, the senior leadership don't know everything that's going on the ground everywhere, and so sometimes we would give random acts of information kindness to our senior leadership. And what I mean by that is we knew if they were traveling to a particular country, we'll say, well, we can give you an information packet of, the stuff that we know that's going on. Like, how often how often code being used, what's the speak up rate, how many third parties are going. And they actually really appreciate that, because now they've got something, rather than it just being a meet and greet, they've actually got something that they can work with in terms of information to be asking more fully informed questions.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of people assume probably is that executive going over there, they assume that person knows everything they need to know about that thing.
That's right.
In many cases, they're probably on that plane being like, what the heck am I going to talk about? I hope that there's questions. But now you're giving them something substantial where they can make something out of that for themselves to get a better lay of the land, or get a better, assessment of what's actually happening on the front lines. That's right. Again, it's very smart.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also, what's cool about that is you're thinking about ways to build a relationship through providing value, right? You're not going to that leader and saying, hey, would you mind pushing my narrative for me, and really leaning on these guys and telling them you're going to be mad at them, but you're adding value to them, which is great for the organization. And it's great to help do this thing that we all like to talk about, is we need to get the tone at the top, and we want the leaders to buy into the vision for our culture of compliance and ethics. And it's a great way to do that, instead of just saying, hey, can you get on a video, but saying, hey, this is probably part of your job and something you care about, and let me make this an easier trip for you and give you some context. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, we would take, if we think more broadly about kind of cultural health as part of our cultural health assessments. We found it really fascinating. Like, if you think about the traditional old school compliance risk assessment, where you'd have someone from corporate headquarters rocking up every 2 years to a location and asking a bunch of questions, submitting maybe a survey, maybe doing a bit of data digging, and coming back and saying, right, I'm all done. I'll see you in 2 years' time. I mean, that just, looking back now, I think, how do we think that was effective?
Right.
And so the dynamic was wrong, in that it was us coming to those locations and trying to extract information. Because of the work that we did and the investment we put into the data analytics, it flipped. So we had access to as much, if not more, information about what was going on at a local level. And then we would communicate that through the survey results, and then our objective metrics on the compliance program performance in that particular location. And we would put those together before the leadership, and they were super interesting. What was really interesting was that they would then apply their own interpretations to what that data was saying. So we didn't kind of prejudge the outcome of that data. We didn't say, okay, this is poor performance. There were maybe some good reasons why there were some lower metrics here on speak up, and then maybe training, there was an issue, whatever. But at least it meant that the discussion wasn't, oh, compliance is coming to town and we need to give them a whole bunch of information. It was, oh, wow, this is actually really interesting. And what we were also able to do was show a comparison about how their results performed against other locations. And then you get into a bit of a competitive spirit between, say, country managers and site leaders who want to kind of be seen to be doing well relative to their peers. And again, that value of the discussion. So having the discussion about what the results, the information is saying, and then the remediation, moving as quickly, because that's really all the main thing that matters, is what are you actually going to do with the information that you're discussing? And then making sure that you're closing out that remediation.
I mean, there's just, I feel like a broken record sometimes, but there are so many opportunities for us to show our usefulness to other parts of the organization because of our skill set, like I was saying, because of our access to different data. And there's always a way, to your point, to make that provision of that data, or, the presentation of that information to be something that's collaborative and not like punitive, or, you know what I'm saying? That reinforces this, like, you know, this
That's
bad
right.
brand that like we're still trying to shake off, you know?
No, right. I mean, you're democratizing the information to enable more informed decisions on improvement to happen in a resource sensitive, prioritized way.
Right.
Because we know we can't do everything everywhere at once, for sure.
You talked about when you came into Albemarle, you had sort of developed this like holistic approach, this philosophy.
Yeah.
And you shared a little bit about how you started to kind of develop that as you took over more things and so forth. What did that look like day one, first 100 days? How did you bring that vibe? Was it, I mean, it's probably too hard to even imagine right now, but like, did it just sort of naturally come out because that's just what your posture was? Or were there specific like tactics that you employed as you came in to like try to make the right impression with the right counterparts?
Yeah. So, I mean, in some respects, there's no better time to join as a CCO, right? It's literally the same week that you're self-reporting. So, you know, management support, fantastic. And then also the company, and this is public, had taken a while to make that decision to self-report. Yeah. But what that meant was that the investigation had been going on for some time. And that by extension, the root cause analysis had also been going on for some time in conjunction with outside counsel and outside forensics. So literally, second week, I'm sat down opposite outside counsel, outside forensic. They're walking through the fact patterns the investigation is at that time, and more importantly, the root cause analysis. And I mean, the remediation of that root cause. So figuring out how we were going to eliminate all agents, how we were going to implement a robust due diligence process for our sales in remaining distributors and resellers, travel and expense policy. Like it was already done. And so my marching orders were very clear. It was three things. It was get a remediation plan up and running, build a team, and then enhance the rest of the program. And so actually in those first 100 days, I didn't get anything done. I just built a plan. I mean, that was my first 100 days was about listening, reflecting on that root cause analysis, and building a plan. And actually that plan never finished. It never completed. It was became a rolling 3-year improvement plan that was then got even more richer, even more informed by more subsequent risk assessments that we were doing in conjunction with some outside partners. So, yeah, I mean, it was quite overwhelming at first.
I'm sure.
I mean, just how am I going to do this when I literally at that point had two other people on the team?
Jeez Louise. It's crazy what you did. So I want to kind of go, though, to the kind of start of this whole thing, because I just want to make sure that we capture kind of the dynamics at play. And I'd love to hear kind of a high level of like what caused the issue. I'd love to hear a little bit about that debate about the self-reporting. It sounds like that decision was made sort of like they were going to make that decision and you were going to kind of come in and execute. And I think that was a really unique aspect, that self-reporting thing, but also coupled with like the time it took to do the self-reporting. There's been a lot written about it, and it's just a very, very interesting case. So I'd love to kind of talk about it from a high level, and then we can dive into some of what those details are. Yeah.
So I know I've spoken a fair bit about this, but for some people who are not aware of the background to the Albemarle case, so the case revolved around the activities of certain sales agents and employees in Albemarle's refining catalyst business. So what are refining catalysts? They are these kind of chemical products that are put into oil refineries, one, to make them run more efficiently, and then two, to take out bad stuff before it gets released into the atmosphere. So they do two different purposes. And you absolutely need these into refineries, and it's a big business where you're dealing with state-owned oil companies and privately owned oil companies. And so the conduct in question was in a number of countries around the world, and there was a slight split between the areas of focus of the DOJ and the areas of focus from the SEC from a controls point of view. But the schemes are very similar. So the classic scheme would be a sales agent would be appointed, and let's say the commission payable would be like 5%. And then after a year, the agent would come knocking on the door and start sucking through teeth saying, I'm really sorry, but I think, customers threatening to terminate you. We need to increase the commission to 10% so that I can kind of take care of things. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but you can see the detail in the DOJ and the SEC orders. And so, I mean, then, those commissions get increased. And then there's kind of like a question about controls, about the ability to make improvements for commission payments unilaterally by frontline salespeople with no oversight, no contract or contracts not being signed, due diligence being done after the event. And then, really interesting dynamic between the frontline salespeople and leadership of the frontline leadership hearing these messages coming back from agents and knowing full well kind of like what that meant, to the point where some of the managers are going, so there could be some FCPA issues here, but if I was in your shoes, I wouldn't do this, but you can do it, even though that's a direct report of the manager. Right. So, some a classic textbook kind of third-party kind of bribery, corruption type scenarios, which are regaled, as I say, in full detail in the orders. And so with that, the investigation, the allegations came to the attention of the company, and that's not public in terms of how that came about. And then an internal investigation was started in conjunction with outside counsel and outside forensic. And what's interesting, what's called out by the DOJ in a positive way, is that even though the investigation was still ongoing, the company started remediation almost right from the start. So, if in 2017, so the year before I joined, the CEO, the board, the leadership team, they made the decision in principle of putting a really robust business justification review process for agents and distributors. Like, is there a valid business justification? Is there a local legal requirement? And all third parties were put through that assessment process. And in the end, all agents were terminated. All agents, not just in the refining catalyst, across the 3 GBUs. And if you think about what that means, it means hiring a new sales force, putting in place new legal entities in those countries, figuring out the supply chain to get the products, and then convincing customers, SOE customers, to no longer use agents. And so all of that work had started before I joined, and then I kind of came on board and helped kind of lead it, particularly on the due diligence side, and then supporting the legal department with the termination processes and everything else.
I mean, it's hard to wrap the mind around how extensive of a surgery that is. That's like you going to your house and saying, I don't like these copper pipes. I want to get plastic pipes in here. And you're like ripping out all the walls and replacing all the pipes. I mean, it is so extensive to change. It's not like you just had like 5 agents. You know what I'm saying? You had hundreds and hundreds of these guys across dozens and dozens of countries, maybe more,
Yeah, no, that's right. And it wasn't just agents, it was distributors as well. There were distributors that were terminated, particularly in some of our other business units. And then what was really interesting is that we applied this, even though it wasn't the bullseye of the investigation root cause, we applied the same approach to freight forwarder and custom brokers. So we went from 100 freight forwarder custom brokers down to less than 10. Wow. And we were doing that and implementing all that through COVID, right, with all the supply chain logistics issues. So that we found kind of like super interesting was, if you think about tone from the top, yes, you can have messages from leadership, sure, and that's super important. But, when you're talking about management making really tough decisions to transform their go-to-market strategy, that is real tone from the top.
Yeah, I mean, it sends such a powerful message.
Yeah.
So you're changing all of these folks out. Man, I just
Here, can I jump in with something?
Go ahead.
Andrew, you talked about how I loved how you put it. The plan never got complete; it got improved and enhanced and adapted.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people in our audience have been in and around an enforcement and correction like this, and a lot of them haven't. Looking back on that and how much of that plan got changed, do you have any reflections on how you would have done it differently up front? Like, do you feel like it was too detailed up front and because you were never going to get to year 3, or maybe going through the process made it easier to iterate it because you had thought through it?
It's a tough question because if I'd had the luxury of choice, then yes, I would have perhaps smoothed things out over an extended period. But the challenge I had was that I knew I had to build a program, and I knew that I was going to have to present on it to the DOJ and the SEC. I just didn't know when, and that was a real kind of source of pressure. And so it meant that we were fighting on all fronts to get the program built, but doing it with kindness, as I say, in collaboration with other functions. And then the other thing is that the company had made some really great decisions on tech selection. So it was rolling out one ERP system, one HR information management system, an enhanced expense management system, which is great, right? From a compliance embedding kind of processes into system stuff, but they were all happening at the same time. And so I'd use the metaphor of like all these trains were leaving the station, and I needed to make sure that compliance was on each and every one of these trains. Wow. Because from a design point of view, you have to make sure you get in early and get your ethics and compliance requirements bedded into those system designs before things get too late. So things like master data, approvals, delegations of authority, I mean, we were right there. Now, what I'll say is there's obviously a temptation during that first year to just try and push everything out. But I resisted that. I really wanted myself and the team that were growing to really get to understand the company and really understand the risk profile, so that our program was then truly right-sized. And so, notwithstanding a fair amount of pressure from my boss and then also from outside counsel, not least because of the investigation, we did not actually launch one new policy for a full year after I joined. But then literally the 6 months into the second year, was really when everything started to happen. New policies, new systems, processes, procedures, all happening in quick succession. It was quite a whirlwind, which was pretty good job because we ended up going in for the first time to present on the program at the 2-year anniversary of me being at Albemarle.
Cool. Wow. So it was like 1 year of planning, 1 year of just ripping stuff out, and then boom, you're like presenting.
Yeah, and you've got to show it's not just you've implemented. We actually had to try and show that it was working as well, right? It wasn't paper-based. It wasn't a brand new system. That it was actually working, and so really kind of tried to make sure that we were able to present a robust story there.
So if we talk about the self-reporting thing real quick, I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, what was that process like? Yeah, I mean, it's a big decision, right? Hui Chen would say you shouldn't self-report all the time. Other folks would say, if you see something, say something, report all the time, right? So I would imagine that there was a long, drawn-out debate during that time. So I'd like to hear about that. And I also wonder, do you feel like the response from the regulators on the self-reporting was influenced in any way by the response from leadership before the investigation was even done? Like, did that get you any points? You know what I'm saying? Because you said, hey, even before it was done, we started making some changes and we were kind of taking it seriously. Did that feed into the response, you think? Yeah, so a bit to unpack there, but I'll try best. And I have to be
respectful of confidentiality, but also the fact that I wasn't there at the time that this decision to self-report was made. But what I can kind of is paint the picture. It's difficult to kind of think back that far as to kind of like what the environment was. But that period, 2017, And then 2018, when the decision was when we actually did the self-report, that was only literally like a year or so, a half after the self-reporting kind of pilot scheme was put into place. So it was still incredibly new and fresh. And concepts of timely reporting were really, I think there was guidance on that only published for the first time in late 2017. So around about the time that we were. Whereas now, I mean, obviously under the prior DOJ administration, they'd set out, which I think technically still holds, all of this kind of like expectations and what timely disclosure kind of like looks like. And, that was obviously several years after we went in. And so for the company kind of making that decision, I'm speculating, there wasn't as much kind of clarity as to kind of what it was getting itself in for by going through that self-reporting. So it was a thing to go in at that point and do that and that self-report. Then to your point about the remediation, I mean, I think that some of the speeches that the DOJ made last year, they were commenting on the fact that yes, Albemarle got the 45%. It didn't get the extra 5% because it did not do timely self-reporting. But it was very insistent in saying that the extent of that cooperation that Albemarle did meant that it got the 45%, which equates to about $85 million of saving through the cooperation and the compliance program that we put into place.
Did you get any contingent clause in your employment agreement?
Yeah. I wish. That would have been nice. What I could say is probably the most tangible benefits of that immediate, in principle decision to terminate agents or to actually get rid of agents was the dynamic before with the DOJ and the SEC. I mean, it really sent a message, right? Going back to that tone from the top, it sent a very clear message that we were taking this incredibly seriously, both at the management level in terms of what they were doing and in the compliance program, which me and the compliance team were doing. And, I found the engagement with both the DOJ and the SEC to be very, very respectful of what we had done. And it developed a degree of trust, I think, in the company.
Yeah, and also probably between them and you. You showed also as a representative of the company that like, hey, we're super serious about this. You saw that we were serious because we self-reported. You see that we're serious because we're changing out all these agents. We're changing our entire business model, which is not a insignificant investment or an insignificant risk for a company that's already running in public and making money and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of risk just in executing, there's a lot of risk in just executing this vision, which again sends such a strong signal.
And that's a really important point, Nick, is the humility that we tried to show in that engagement with the DOJ SEC of when things were working and when we would try things and then they wouldn't work, or there were just practical challenges of terminating agents is not easy, right? Like particularly in some countries, it's really not easy, and so don't sugarcoat that. And so that's the role of a chief compliance officer. Of you're not just you're there, kind of like slightly independent of the company, right? So you're trying to be this kind of honest broker of calling out the things which are good for the company, but also talking about some of the challenges, practical challenges are faced by the company in executing.
The thing I was struck with as you've talked about your interactions with DOJ and as you've kind of talked about your story, like as I've listened to it, I was always, let me zoom out. There seems to be this undercurrent of fear in our market of like, I don't want to mess it up. I don't want to get in trouble. Yeah. And, DOJ puts out guidance that says you need to have an effective compliance program. And everybody's like, I don't even know what that means. Like, what does effective mean? Yeah. That question in itself, in my mind, is a focus on like, how do I satisfy this sort of like faceless, monster that might sort of come out from under the bed. Okay. When you talk about it, though, it seems to me that you weren't trying to like satisfy some, you weren't trying to satisfy some questionable guidance. You were more trying to satisfy yourself. Like, does this make sense to me? Am I right about that kind of assessment of like how you move through it? Or how did you get over the lack of clarity around what effective means? And how did you bring that humility that actually resonated with them to where they kind of believed you?
Right. So, I think that go back to the planning piece. So I was absorbing a lot of information about the company, and then there's also its risk. So, through a risk assessment that we had done as well. And so that was feeding into a plan, which was articulating kind of like the requirements coming out from the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, but then also we were having to be mindful of certain sustainability standards on human rights that had a crossover into things like speak up mechanisms. And so we had our plan that effectively distilled those requirements into actions. And then in order to demonstrate that those program elements were working, we needed data to kind of demonstrate that. So we needed the investment in our data analytics. And what's super interesting is that I didn't realize it at the time, but all of that work that I've been doing, initially at BHP, but then at Albemarle, was just me gearing up to the risk and integrity bridge, the risk and compliance consulting practice, because that's what I'm kind of doing now. Is that concept of effectiveness is multifaceted, right? So you're looking at it from a governance point of view. So the hallmarks, going through the hallmarks and looking at all of those and the design standards around your governance, your training, your communications, monitoring, audit, so on and so forth. You're also looking at it from an end-to-end process point of view. So how does that compliance process fit within business processes and systems? Like, think about procurement. Yes, you've got your due diligence, your screen. How does that fit within vendor qualification? How does it fit with vendor management, the accounts payable process? So there's the end-to-end. There's also one that I think is sometimes missed is how is that program being executed by a compliance team? So when it comes to the conduct of due diligence or the conduct of investigations by a compliance team, are they doing it to an appropriate standard, and are they doing it consistently? So there's a consistency and a quality of execution point. And then underneath all of that is your metrics. And irrespective, yes, I knew I was going to have to present to the DOJ and the SEC, but ultimately, if you're spending money in a compliance program, at the end, you want to ensure it's actually working. And if there's work that you're doing that doesn't actually move the needle, either for you or management, like a dashboard, right? You put this effort into a dashboard, but no one's using it. Stop doing it. Move on. Deploy that resource to something else. And so I think that my kind of biggest stakeholder was almost myself. Is this really an effective use of resources? And now knowing that I've got additional responsibilities in things like risk management or forced labor, is that resource better deployed over there? And so fortunately, that also happily coincided with sales team really being happy about us being before customers, and so they were supportive. Our IT function being happy because they were a big proponent of wanting to use a data lake, and so we were happy to be their first customers of that data lake. And so it was a kind of like this, pragmatic approach to building a program that we wanted to make sure was the appropriate use of resources and was working, and we could demonstrate that it was working to different stakeholders.
Andrew, I'd love to talk a little bit about the team that you were working with on doing this. I think that there's especially, I think that leadership is so important for anyone in compliance and ethics, not least of all because there's so much influence that we need to have that you really need to balance kind of relationship and authority to do it. But also you were managing through a lot of transformation. Right. I imagine there were, probably pretty much everybody on your team hadn't been through this before. So talk to me a little bit about the people side of it, of, how you manage people on your team, or, where you saw people kind of get up the learning curve and it make a big difference. I'm sure you learned a bunch through it, but I'm sure you also led your team through a lot of transformation.
Yeah.
question.
So I had some past before addressing Albemarle. I had done something similar. It was different but similar at BHP, and so I moved from that antitrust role up to associate general counsel. Then I got appointed acting chief compliance officer at the back end of BHP's own FCPA investigation. And one of my mandates was to take a fresh look at the compliance team and recalibrate accountabilities and roles. And so that was an established compliance team with like 30 plus compliance professionals, and go through a organizational design review. And that was super, again, didn't realize at the time, super helpful preparation for then building my own team at Albemarle, right from scratch. So I joined Albemarle, there was one person based out in China, and then I was shortly joined by another person in the US. And it was the three of us for quite an extended period of time through that 2018, as I then started to clearly articulate, because you can't just say, right, I need people. You actually have to figure out like what kind of people do I need and where am I going to put them?
Yeah.
And so I think if it was the 100-day mark or the 200-day mark, I then eventually sat down with the general counsel and gave my resource plan. And for me, what the primary considerations were how did I want to align the compliance function with other functions and the business units. So, but firstly, compliance. As much I reported to a general counsel / chief administrative officer. So importantly, yes, she managed the legal department, but I was not part of the legal department. I was running the compliance department, and I was reporting to her in my her capacity as chief administrative officer. She also had IT and HR under her as well for a period. And so we were, I was effectively creating a new brand, Global Ethics and Compliance. Then when it comes to the recruiting of the team, so we were obviously a multinational company, so I wanted there to be regional spread so that there were local people at the water cooler that people could speak to and approach. So that was a consideration. And then by extension, an alignment of those compliance team with particular business units. So we had a compliance manager initially down in Chile. Obviously, in Chile, it was all about lithium because that's where some of our lithium operations were. Whereas in Singapore, it was more of a sales thing. So it was across all three business units, having that understanding of the commercial issues associated with sales and to some extent procurement. And then in other countries, it was a mix, right? In the United States, it's both bromine and lithium and catalyst. So there was that alignment piece. And then also from a professional background point of view, a big proponent, no JD required, right? So I wouldn't insist on it being lawyers on my team. If they had a legal background, that was helpful in some respects, but it wasn't a prerequisite. And in the end, I had a mixture of former CCOs, very blessed to get 2 former CCOs on my team. I have forensic accountants, I had lawyers, I had a former head of procurement, a data analyst, and then a compliance program administrator. So I had that mix. And then if we go to from a broader diversity point of view, in the end, when I left Albemarle, it was 13, 14 people. We had 12 different nationalities and a split of 55% female, 45% male. So that diversity and breadth of experience, backgrounds was, I thought, super, super helpful.
When you were dealing, so I'm so fascinated by this thing that I've kind of seen, I guess. And, I talked about it a little bit, but, you kind of said it yourself, like your first stakeholder is yourself. And does this make sense to me? Does this does this allocation of resource actually move the needle? And if it doesn't, you had the confidence to say, well, I'm not going to put resources over there. I'm going to put them over here. That is, some people write and the pencil just kind of barely brushes the page. And some people write and you can feel the letters on the backside of the page. The second, the latter is a much more sort of purposeful, like I know where every one of these lines go. And I think that's kind of a metaphor for it, how it seems from the outside on how you kind of conducted yourself through this investigation and through this whole process. Where did that confidence come from? Is that just common sense to you? Is it something that you developed as you got more confident in yourself? And how does that confidence, or how is that confidence influenced by your belief of reasonability? I think there is a fear that, I think there's an unfounded fear. This is just based on nothing. I think there's an unfounded fear that when DOJ comes in or some external party comes in and you have to demonstrate effectiveness, which, who knows if I'm freaking even being effective, that they're not going to be reasonable, and they're not going to be reasonable. They're not going to have a reasonable lens that they're going to view your efforts through. So talk to me a little bit about that confidence and that sort of reliance on the reasonability.
Yeah. So great question. Two great questions. So, and this is a bit of humility here, is that, early on in my career, I would say I was a classic exhibitor of imposter syndrome, right? So I mentioned I came from a small English countryside town, and then suddenly I was rubbing shoulders at Linklaters with people from Cambridge, Oxford, super smart people, at least, that was the perception. But then when I was through my career at Linklaters, what I realized was that some of the questions that I had, which I thought were an insecurity that I didn't know something, I was actually asking questions that other people weren't asking themselves or didn't even know themselves.
Yeah.
And that was super liberating for me. Is okay, so maybe I'm thinking of things in a different way, and I should embrace that. And so when I joined, particularly BHP, and I was then stepping out of the antitrust comfort blanket, what I began to realize was that that imposter syndrome, that feeling of, I'm not sure I'm the master of this, I need to be exhibiting curiosity and asking questions and demonstrating humility, meant that I was actually able to get to grips with a new area in a really good way, and bring my experience of program design to bear, and be thinking in a way that wasn't as siloed as perhaps some certain subject matter experts. And so what I would say is that by moving into different areas of compliance and applying that same approach, you get an extra layer of confidence in the way in which you kind of go about doing things, and that extends to your approach to risk assessment, which goes to your second question about, is the DOJ really going to start challenging on kind of like your program? And I've said this before in public, that if you have done your risk assessment in the appropriate way, and you are a compliance officer who has really genuinely thought about program design based off that risk profile, notwithstanding FCPA enforcement pause, but if you were before the DOJ or the SEC, my sense is they're not going to second guess your judgment, because how are they going to know the intricacies of a risk profile for a specialty chemicals mining producer operating in these different countries? They're just not.
How could they?
And I don't think they expect they expect you to have done that risk assessment, and they expect you to have built your program on that, and they'll ask questions. But I never got a challenge as to why have you taken this approach to your risk assessment or to your program design.
Yeah, I mean, they're a lot closer in my mind to like a financial statement auditor, right? Like when an auditor comes in, of course they know GAAP financials, they know auditing techniques. Of course, they know what major risks might be in the type of industry or the type of business that they're auditing. And so, of course, their opinion is partially, at least, a function of objective things, objective testing, all that kind of stuff, sampling. But the other major piece of their opinion is very subjective, in my experience. When, if you're coming in as an auditor, of course, you're going to do those audit procedures, but you're also kind of gauging, like, does this person, like, are they about their business? Do they understand the risks here? If I bring up a control that's missing, is that a surprise to them, or do they say, yeah, I get that control is missing, but if you look here, it's not really a big risk for us. This is an immaterial risk. Well, that gives me comfort as an auditor is to say like, okay, this person kind of knows their business. Did you feel that kind of like feeling out, like when two dogs are at the park, they kind of sniff each other's butts to kind of get to know each other. Did you feel some of that as they were kind of trying to get to know you and trying to kind of see what kind of a guy you were?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think that the first session that I had with them was perhaps a little bit more, standoffish in the sense that they were kind of in listening mode. But then I think in the second session, it was almost just this genuine curiosity as to what we had done and an opportunity for them to hear from us. And so I found it to be a really interesting experience. I mean, obviously, it's not something that you would wish on people to be in that situation before them. But again, I go back to if your management has shown the commitment, which they had, both in terms of the decision to self-report, to cooperate, and then to do the remediation. If your compliance program is risk-based and your program is well-resourced, and you can demonstrate that it's working, you've won almost more than half the battle.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the end of this thing. So you guys got the 45%.
Yeah.
Was that a function? Like, did you make a final presentation and then they kind of went back and figured out what the declination would be or something like that? And tell me about what that period was like. And were there talks of you guys thought you'd get 20% and it blew it out of the water? What was the reaction inside the company when that 45% was printed?
Yeah. So, I went in a few months before kind of the resolution, and there is there's a negotiation, which, we had intentionally separated responsibility between me being very much focused on the compliance program improvement, and then the general counsel kind of focused on the negotiation of the investigation and the settlement, and then me in support. And so, and I can't get into kind of the precise mechanics of that negotiation, but I mean, obviously, it was the 45%, but I think for me personally, a bigger takeaway was no monitor, right? Which goes to trust, right? They trusted the work that we had done, and it wasn't going to snap back the moment that the resolution was agreed. And so, and yes, I mean, so there was a announcement at the time within the company and the team. It's a great result for the team, and I'd already left by then, but it was so wonderful for the team, for the company to get the Compliance Program of the Year award. It was just, that was really kind of just appropriate and due recognition for just an incredibly huge amount of work done, and not just by the ethics compliance team, but other functions as well, the legal department or audit function, procurement, sales. We had all kind of stepped up to do that. And it was nice to see the DOJ at the time kind of calling out the work that the company had done.
Yeah, it seems like so much of it went so well, and I know that it took a ton of work, and I'm sure there were a lot of hard nights and tough decisions and things like that. But you and the team that you worked with really pushed it to all things considered, a strong outcome, and not getting a monitor is a huge vote of confidence for that. What of it do you wish had gone differently? Even if it was just the way that you thought about it or something like that.
Yeah. It's so difficult with hindsight, but I mean, I think that, during this time, obviously, it was just everything everywhere all at once, right? Because we had, the investigation, we had the big focus on sustainability, all the systems being put in place, COVID happening.
Yeah.
Jeez.
I mean, it was utterly,
it was like 10 years in 2 years.
Relentless.
It's crazy.
I mean, it was just crazy. And I think that the one, I wouldn't say which I changed, but one of the challenges that we had is that kind of the ratchet effect of changes in the DOJ guidance as we were going through. So I mean, because we've already given the example of there was not much guidance at the time that we made the decision to self-report, and now there is. Well, it's the same with the compliance program, and it was personified by one of my last meetings. We were due to meet on St. Patrick's Day, one before the DOJ and the SEC, and on the way to the meeting, the General Counsel fell over, broke an arm, and the meeting had to be postponed. And it was pushed back by 2 weeks. And in between those 2 weeks, the DOJ updated their guidance, including things on ephemeral messaging. And so there's this mad scramble to make sure that the work that we had already been doing on ephemeral messaging, that was still, good, and that we were ready to address any questions at the DOJ. But it was a really good illustration of, it wasn't like a fixed target that we were working to from a program of design and effectiveness. That those expectations were continually evolving.
Yeah, it's out of date before you even launched it, huh?
Right.
That's wild.
So it's a well-deserved. I think you guys winning that award is great. There's a lot of great stuff going on in our market right now, but for you guys to win it, I think is phenomenal. I think the result was noteworthy, and I think you just brought kind of this next level thinking to the compliance program. And I think you saw that gain traction and build a bunch of effectiveness quickly and build trust with these external regulators who were kind of inspecting what's going on over there. So that was kind of your last chapter. And now you've stepped into the Integrity Bridge chapter. And so talk to us a little bit about how you feel Integrity Bridge is going to be a different sort of fresh set of kind of perspectives in the market.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. So, as a compliance officer, particularly one going through successive FCPA investigations, you're a really significant consumer of professional services. And so you get a pretty good sense of kind of like what it is you need, and then whether kind of providers are out there. And I've got a huge amount of respect for other types of service provider, like outside counsel, for forensic, for what they do. But I felt, and if you look at outside counsel and the forensic, in terms of their backgrounds, there's not too many of them who've had actually the in-house experience of building programs from within. And so you think, well, is there a role for consultants who have had that in-house experience, who understand the political, the financial, the strategic, the operational, the technology, the data analytics challenges of building and implementing and testing a program? And I generally felt that there was. And so, I left Albemarle, and the name Integrity Bridge literally just popped into my head. And it was all riffing around this concept of gaps and bridging gaps between different areas of compliance, bridging gaps between compliance and different functions, and gaps between outside counsel and with outside tech providers. I felt that there was something needed. And so Integrity Bridge was set up, and it's really threefold. So one is supporting corporate clients with coming in and taking a look at their particular element of their program. Could be third-party screening, due diligence, speak up, and just taking that holistic assessment of whether it's effective. A second lens is working with compliance tech providers on their technology, how they can improve, and then supporting clients who have adopted technology and how they want to implement it. And then third, which is more of a philanthropic thing, is just providing mentoring to junior members of the compliance profession. And so it's just been up and running officially since September last year. I had my first client about 11 months ago, and it's just been an absolute blast, kind of like supporting that broad mix of compliance officers and compliance tech companies. It just making things better, improving, and just using the latest technology to do it.
Yeah, it's probably really rewarding because you can probably come in and make a huge impact very quickly and kind of pull from this toolbox that you've accumulated over the years.
Yeah, no, it's been fun, whether it's review of a third-party screening kind of platform, helping run an RFP process, getting to the right outcome for the client, I mean, technology is moving so fast these days that tech selection decision is really absolutely critical. And so, I'm having kind of great fun of professionally and technically geeking out because it's just I just really enjoy doing it.
Well, your passion is apparent, and this industry is lucky to have you, especially because you're so generous with your insights and your story. I think as we step into this next chapter, it's going to look a lot different for our industry and for the people in it. If we can adopt more of these kind of mindsets of not trying to solve for a check the box or not just trying to do a task because we were told to do it, but really driving toward effectiveness and satisfying our own selves, because anybody who's in this space got the job for a reason, right? Like there's not a lot of compliance officers who got the job based on a fog the mirror test. Like, here's a mirror, fog it. Okay, cool. You have a pulse, you got the job. It's always because we have a background or an experience that can lend itself to this. And I think the more we can stand on that experience and get that confidence, because to something you were saying before, the occurrence or the existence of like inferiority complex or that imposter syndrome is not an indication that you're an imposter. It's just an indication that you're a human being. That's it. So having those feelings does not mean that you should shut up. Having those feelings is just great. I'm still alive and I need to satisfy myself so that I can do my actual job. I just think that pivot is so powerful because it really lets us spread our wings a little bit more,
Yeah. Curiosity is amazing.
Yeah. And I love what you brought up earlier, Andrew, that when, I think you were shortly out of school or something, and you felt that imposter syndrome, you realized that you were asking questions that maybe people who felt like they should belong thought, hey, I shouldn't, I shouldn't ask that. I'm going to look dumb. And just that curiosity. And that I think that ties to what Nick was talking about. There's so many people in compliance and ethics who want it to be better and want to figure out the right way to do it. And, I think that as we all as leaders better understand that the fact that we don't know how to do it doesn't mean we're going to do it poorly. And in fact, maybe the fact that we're worried about doing it so well can be one of our greatest strengths, to be curious, to ask those questions, and to keep pushing for those things that we may not know are on the horizon, right? We may not know when the internal communication guidelines are going to change, but it can still be a strength that helps us be prepared, just like you and your team were through, the moving goalposts and the moving targets while you were building this program and rebuilding it.
Yeah, it's a true superpower, I think.
Yeah.
Well, this was a lot of fun. 200th episode in the bag.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming on, man. We could have probably talked for another couple of hours, but this was a lot of fun. I encourage any listener to follow Andrew on LinkedIn, check out Integrity Bridge, get a little shot in the arm, level your program up. You know what I mean?
Thanks, Nick.
Absolutely. We'll see you guys next time.